So I think you can all agree it's been lovely all being in a room together today after 3 years of being away. And what we know is that our social connections are really important determinants of health. And having good social health is also important for our well-being. But when we lack those social connections, or we perceive our social connections to be lacking in quality or quantity, then we begin to see the significant adverse effects that it can have on our health and well-being. And we see that with sort of loneliness and social isolation, particularly when they're in their chronic forms. So for clarity, I have put, let's see if these work. That work? There you go. So for clarity, I have put some definitions on the slide of what loneliness and social isolation is. Something we all think we know, because maybe we've experienced it. And we often think that loneliness means we're alone. But actually, we can see that loneliness is a negative emotion that occurs when, as an individual, you perceive there to be a disconnect in the quality or the quantity of the relationships you'd like to have compared to those you have. And when you notice that disconnect, that's when you feel that negative emotion of loneliness. And in contrast, social isolation refers to the absence of contact with other people, or if we have a very small network, we'll feel that we're socially isolated. And of course, what this means is that someone with a very small network of friends who meet all their needs will never feel lonely, whereas somebody with a large group of friends may feel lonely because those relationships lack something, whether that's the quality or the person would like a larger social network. And so, of course, you can be isolated without being lonely, or you can be lonely without being isolated, or of course, you can be both. Now, loneliness is a common emotion. As I said, it's one that any one of us can experience at any time. But as with most things in life, it's not all created equal. And some people and some groups of people are more prone to loneliness or more vulnerable to loneliness. And that's older adults, particularly in advanced older age, people living with disabilities or chronic conditions. And we know, for example, that 50% of people with a disability will report loneliness. The BBC Loneliness Survey in 2018 found that loneliness prevalence was very high, particularly in 16 to 24-year-olds, where 42% of those people in that age group reported being lonely. Informal carers, so the Ideal study found that 44% of informal carers experienced moderate loneliness and 18% were experiencing severe loneliness. We know that entering a care home can also be a trigger point for loneliness, and individuals from ethnic minority communities, migrants and refugees, the LGBT community, again, all see high prevalence rates. And then in younger groups, we see care leavers, people living in areas of high deprivation. So we know there's a socioeconomic gradient in loneliness. So the poorer you are, the more likely you are to experience it. And then obviously we'd see loneliness in the homeless community. And the problem we have is that when we see broader reported statistics and figures on loneliness, these subgroups are actually hidden away, and we don't really explore these loneliness in these specific groups. And this is important that we understand the lived experience of these different subgroups of the population who are at higher risk, because their loneliness trajectories will be very different. And actually, if we're going to develop interventions to either prevent or alleviate loneliness, we need to understand what those loneliness trajectories are. So, why is this important? Loneliness is more than an individual thing, and we often think it's down to, it's an individual experience, but actually it's a wider societal issue. Loneliness and social isolation are influenced and shaped by wider societal factors such as legislation, welfare, policies, and I think Dave's slide sort of illustrated some of that, the cross-connecting WHO, you know what I mean? Yeah, anyway, it's been a long day. And to give you an example of this, we know that, for example, financial and material conditions are really important factors that shape and influence our social connections across the life course, and they'll influence whether we, how many social connections we have, or how much social contact we have with other people. Likewise, the built environment, the neighbourhood and wider society can also influence whether somebody's more at risk of loneliness. So things such as a fear of crime, neighbourhood safety, if we see areas where there's lots of gated back lanes and graffiti and broken street lights, that can send a message out that this place is not safe, your neighbours are not to be trusted. you're less likely to go out and connect with them. And then, well, we have this also know that things like societal norms, ageism, discrimination, and stereotypes of all types can contribute to exclude people from social participation, civic participation. And this slide here, we can see a range of reported measures. And I'm going to focus specifically on people with disabilities because I think they're an important group that we need to focus on. So in this first slide, we can see a range of reported measures that shape and influence the prevalence of loneliness among people with a disability. So we know for a fact that people who are disabled have a lower employment rates. They're more likely to be a victim of crime, and they're more likely to be a social renter. And as I said, if we use social renting sometimes as a proxy of wealth. So as I said, we've got this socioeconomic gradient. We also see it in participation rates across the life course. So the blue bands are people with disabilities and the yellow bands are people who are non-disabled. And you can see that participation rates are lower from children and youth services, children's education and schools, right through to sport and exercise, health and social welfare. And likewise, we can see here, this is about employment gaps. So if you are disabled, the employment gap widens as you get older. And this is really important because there are about 14.6 million people in the UK who are disabled. It's approximately 22% of the population, and that's grown 4% in the last decade. And because of COVID and various other factors, we're likely to see that figure increase even further. And as I said, loneliness is not just a personal issue. It's embedded in given forms of social and cultural fabrics. People with a disability, maybe have different trends in marriage and employment patterns, which we've just seen on the slide. Fertility patterns might differ depending on the nature of their disability. When we know that marriage patterns also differ. So, for example, some studies done in Sweden a few years ago, looking at siblings, found that siblings with a disability were less likely to be married or have a partner than their peers or their sibling. So that in turn influences the composition of any sort of support that's available to them. So all these factors shape how people integrate into society, and then we have those stereotypes and discrimination and so forth that further excludes people. So what we do know, I'm sorry, I've gone too far. Yeah. So what we do know is that when we look at disability research, we know that research is done on specific groups of people with disabilities. So maybe somebody with groups with Down syndrome or cerebral palsy have been researched in terms of loneliness. When we look at the loneliness research, we see that it's being looked at prevalence, but we very rarely look at prevalence in older adults or in people with older adults, people aging with a disability. But what research does show in terms of the disability research is there's a cut-off point, and when you're an older adult, it's almost perceived to be a norm that you will be disabled, therefore you're excluded from that research. And I think if we really want to create an inclusive society, we need to understand that lived experience of disability right across the life course, across a range of disabilities. And especially if we want to alleviate or mitigate the high levels of loneliness among this particular group of the population, we need to understand that lived experience across a range of disabilities, their trajectories into loneliness, and how we can support their trajectories back out, because you can recover from loneliness. We often think it's something that once you're in there, that's it. It's more difficult when you experience chronic loneliness, but it's not impossible. But if we want to develop interventions that are personalised and tailored to specific groups, we need to understand that lived experience. And I think that's the only way that if there's these important gaps in our knowledge of ageing with a disability in terms of loneliness, and I think we want a truly inclusive society, then we need to start plugging those gaps and exploring the research. And as you can see on the slide, this is something I'm keen to develop. So if you've got an interest and you'd like to support the development of research around this area, I'm going to be setting up some research development groups so we can discuss it. So please get in touch with me. I'm going to leave it there. You can contact me on any of those, Lonely Deborah. Yeah, you've got to embrace it. I'm like the Beckhams. And that's me done. I'm going to now hand over. I don't know if Judith has gone.